Ragnarok, the blood-soaked myths that didn't just predict the world's end, they created it. In the frozen north, gods and monsters clashed in a battle that shattered existence itself. This isn't just a myth. It's the terrifying truth behind the apocalypse. What if the end was always destined to come? Let's go back to where it all began. Long before the thunder of battle echoed through the realms, the Norse people lived in constant fear not just of death, but of the monstrous forces that ruled their world. In the cold, desolate corners of Scandinavia, where the wind howled like a wolf in the night, something far darker began to stir. The world they inhabited was one of constant struggles clashing with fire, light battling darkness, and life teetering on chaos. The Norse feared not only gods, but the terrifying monsters that lurked in the cold, waiting to rise. The first of these monsters were the Jotun, the giants of ice and fire, massive, merciless creatures that roamed the land, embodying the raw forces of nature, capable of destroying everything in their path. But the true terror began when the gods of Asgard, Odin, Thor, and Freyja arrived, not as saviors, but as forces bound by fate. They knew the world would end, but were powerless to stop it. In the coldest corners, ancient tombs were found cracked open, bodies face down in submission to an unseen power. Some believed it was the giants stirring. Others feared the earth itself was responding to the coming chaos. Odin, sitting on his throne, could only watch as fate unraveled. In these ancient times, the first signs of something monstrous stirring beneath the surface were unmistakable. The gods knew it was only a matter of time before the very creatures they sought to control would break free. And when they did, nothing would be able to stop them. But something else was stirring beneath the surface. In the days before Ragnarok was spoken of in fear, the Norse people lived in relative harmony with the world around them. They believed their gods were not distant, cold entities, but living, breathing beings who walked among them, protecting them, guiding them, and, most importantly, keeping the darkness at bay. The gods of Asgard were revered as both divine and approachable, watching over the villages scattered across the misty fjords and icy landscapes. The people would gather beneath the pale light of the moon, their homes lit only by flickering candles, offering prayers and sacrifices to the gods. In these rituals, the air was thick with reverence. As they chanted ancient incantations in the dim glow of the fire, they felt safe, protected from the harshness of the world outside. The scent of incense filled the air, blending with the dampness of the earth beneath their feet. To them, the gods were not just protectors but friends, keeping the vast darkness of the world in check. Every winter, as the days grew shorter and the frost crept deeper into the land, the people would gather for the BLT, sacrifice to honor the gods and ensure their favor. They believed that these offerings, whether of grain, cattle, or even the blood of the fallen, would secure a bountiful harvest and protection from the long, cruel winter. The rituals took place in secluded groves or beside sacred trees, where mist curled at the base of the trunks like specters waiting to rise. At these sites, the air would be charged with a sense of awe, as if the very earth beneath their feet was alive with unseen forces. The people would kneel in the snow, heads bowed, as the high priest or priestess made offerings to Odin, Thor, and Freyja, all while the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that seemed to cut through to the soul. But even in this seemingly tranquil world, there were hints of something darker. Whispers spread in hushed voices at the edge of the gatherings, spoken only in the dead of night. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, glimpses of figures taller than any man, walking just beyond the reach of the firelight. Others spoke of strange, unholy voices in the wind, not the sweet murmurings of the gods, but something far more sinister. The people tried to ignore these unsettling thoughts, clinging to their belief that the gods watched over them. But even as they performed their rituals, there was an underlying sense of unease, a faint tug at the edges of their minds, a feeling that perhaps the gods were not as invincible as they seemed. The myths that had once been passed down as comforting tales now hinted at something far darker. The very creatures they had once believed to be legends were no longer content to remain in the shadows. The gods were not simply protecting them from the cold and hunger. They were keeping something else at bay, something ancient, something powerful, something that had always been lurking just out of sight. And though the villagers clung to their belief in the gods' eternal protection, they couldn't shake the feeling that, one day, those rituals might not be enough. But the unease was barely a whisper, just beneath the surface of their comforting beliefs. It wasn't long before the first signs that something was wrong began to appear. At first, they were subtle, small, easily ignored things. But as the whispers grew louder and the cold seemed to bite deeper, it became clear that these weren't just the natural disturbances of an unforgiving world. Something darker, something more sinister was taking hold. It began with strange marks. At first, they were only noticed in the quietest corners of the villages, on the backs of the cattle, carved into the bark of sacred trees, and even etched into the very earth itself. Jagged symbols, unlike anything the people had ever seen, appeared overnight. Some thought it was the work of the giants, or perhaps the trickster god Loki. Others believed it was a sign from the gods, but no one could decipher what it meant. These marks were more than just strange. They were unnatural. Each one seemed to pulse with an energy that made the air feel heavy, as though the very ground beneath them had been touched by something far older than the world itself. Then came the births. At first, there was only one, a child born under the full moon, whose skin was marked with the same strange symbols that had appeared on the cattle and the trees. The villagers whispered, wondering if this child had been chosen by the gods. But soon, others followed, babies born with eyes that glowed in the dark, or with skin as pale as snow, untouched by the warmth of the fire. Mothers who had been healthy before their pregnancies gave birth to stillborn children, their bodies twisted and misshapen, as if something had stolen their souls before they could even take their first breath. Each one of these unnatural births sent waves of fear through the villages. People began to wonder if these children were cursed, or worse, touched by something far darker. Along with the strange births came a growing sickness. It began with the children, but soon it spread to the adults. A persistent fever took hold, one that no herbal remedy or magic could ease. The afflicted would lie in their beds, their bodies racked with tremors, their breath shallow and ragged. Those who recovered found themselves changed, pale and listless, with strange cravings for food they had never touched before. It wasn't just the physical symptoms that frightened them, it was the behavior that followed. People began acting differently, brooding, distant, as though something was gnawing at their minds. The once lively celebrations of the harvest grew somber, with uneasy silences hanging in the air as if the joy of the people had been drained away. Whispers spread that something had been unleashed, a force they didn't understand. Was it a curse, or had the gods allowed some ancient power to slip through the cracks in their realm? Some of the villagers began to fear that the gods themselves were not immune to the darkness creeping into their world. There were suspicions, too. As the sickness spread and the odd behavior increased, certain individuals began to be marked in the eyes of the villagers. It wasn't always a visible mark. Sometimes it was an unnatural stillness in a person's gaze, or a strange aura that clung to them like smoke. There were rumors that those who were marked would soon become vessels for the very darkness threatening their world. Some began to accuse their neighbors of harboring unnatural forces, fearful that anyone could be an unwitting servant of whatever malevolent power was behind it all. The fear grew as every day brought new signs, the crops that refused to grow, the animals that died in strange and violent ways, the unsettling feeling that the very land was turning against them. The people no longer gathered in the sacred groves with the same confidence. Their rituals, once meant to bring protection, now felt like futile gestures in the face of an unstoppable tide. That was only the first crack in the story. As the signs of the strange, creeping darkness continued to multiply, the once peaceful villages of the Norse people began to fracture. What had started as whispers of a curse soon became a full-blown panic, as fear spread faster than the sickness that had taken hold. The villagers, once united by their faith in the gods, now turned on each other, their trust eroding with each passing day. The sense of safety they had once felt was slipping away, replaced by an overwhelming sense that something was watching them. something insidious, something from beyond the realm of the living. The first to feel the sting of suspicion were those who lived on the edges of the village. Outliers, isolated by their land and their families, became the perfect targets. Neighbors began accusing one another, pointing fingers at anyone who seemed even remotely out of place. The tall woman with the dark, unsettling eyes was the first to be whispered about. The man who had once been jovial but now wandered the fields with a distant look in his eyes became the next subject of gossip. The village's community, once tight-knit and supportive, was now fraying at the edges. People began locking their doors at night, refusing to let even friends cross their thresholds for fear they might be harboring the dark influence. But it wasn't just the people who were changing. The world around them seemed to be turning against them as well. The once fertile land had begun to sour. The crops that had once flourished with ease now rotted in the soil before they could even reach full growth. Farmers who had depended on the harvest for survival watched helplessly as their fields withered, turning brown and barren despite their tireless efforts to care for them. The air itself seemed to hang heavy with a sense of foreboding. The winds that once brought fresh scents of pine and wildflowers now carried only a damp, stagnant smell, like the earth itself was decaying. The livestock, once healthy and plentiful, began to die in strange, unexplained ways. Cattle were found with their throats torn open, their bodies drained of blood. Hens, which had never known fear, cowered in their coops, refusing to lay eggs. It was as though the land was becoming poisoned, the creatures within it slowly dying off or succumbing to an unnatural fear. And as each animal fell, so did the spirit of the village. The people no longer greeted the dawn with hope. Instead, they looked to the skies with dread, wondering what the next disaster would be. The fear grew more palpable with each passing day. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving at the edge of their fields, tall, twisted forms that shifted in the moonlight, too large and unnatural to be human. The shadows would vanish as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind nothing but a chill that cut to the bone. No one dared speak of them aloud, but the mention of the shadows became a silent understanding among the villagers. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just a plague or a curse. It was something alive, something that knew the world was its to claim. With every passing night, the terror grew. Those who were ill were found with strange, feverish eyes, muttering in tongues no one could understand. The sick, once cared for by their loved ones, now feared the touch of even their closest family. It was as if the sickness itself had begun to warp the minds of those it touched, twisting their thoughts until they became unrecognizable. The community tried to hold on to their rituals, hoping that the gods might intervene and drive away the growing terror. But no one could escape the sense of inevitability that hung in the air like a storm cloud. The once reassuring glow of the ritual fires seemed to flicker dimly, unable to banish the darkness that crept into every corner. Even the gods seemed silent, distant, as though their attention had been diverted to other realms. The people, though still bound by their faith, felt more isolated than ever. And then, one night, a terrible cry pierced the air, a scream that came from the woods beyond the village, so blood-curdling that it froze every soul who heard it. The cry was not from man or beast. It was something deeper, primal, a sound that spoke of suffering beyond understanding. And from there, everything grew darker. As the signs of the strange, creeping darkness continued to multiply, the once peaceful villages of the Norse people began to fracture. What had started as whispers of a curse soon became a full-blown panic as fear spread faster than the sickness that had taken hold. The villagers, once united by their faith in the gods, now turned on each other, their trust eroding with each passing day. The sense of safety they had once felt was slipping away, replaced by an overwhelming sense that something was watching them, something insidious, something from beyond the realm of the living. The first to feel the sting of suspicion were those who lived on the edges of the village. Isolated by their land and their families, the outliers became the perfect targets. Neighbors began accusing one another, pointing fingers at anyone who seemed even remotely out of place. The tall woman with the dark, unsettling eyes was the first to be whispered about. Her presence was always marked by an uneasy silence, a stillness in the air that made those who passed her feel as if something unseen was lurking in the shadows. Then there was the man who had once been jovial, always found in the center of village festivities. But now, He wandered the fields with a distant look in his eyes, lost in a world the villagers could not comprehend. He was the next to become the subject of hushed gossip and fearful glances. The community, once tight-knit and supportive, was now fraying at the edges. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years now refused to speak, their once warm greetings replaced with guarded stares. Doors were locked at night, even to those who had once been welcome inside. The villagers grew paranoid, convinced that anyone could be carrying the dark influence, unknowingly spreading the curse. But it wasn't just the people who were changing. The world around them seemed to be turning against them as well. The once fertile land began to sour. The crops that had always flourished with ease now rotted in the soil before they could even reach full growth. Fields that had once been golden with grain stood barren, their soil cracked and dry, as if the earth itself had been drained of its vitality. The villagers watched in horror as their livelihoods crumbled before their eyes, their prayers to the gods unanswered. The air itself seemed to carry a strange, unnatural weight. The winds, which had once brought the sweet scent of pine and wildflowers, now carried only a damp, stagnant smell. It was as if the very land had begun to decay, the world around them sickening with some unseen creeping force. The once fresh morning air was now thick with dread, a sense that something far darker than the harsh winter storms had taken hold. The livestock, once healthy and plentiful, began to die in strange and unnatural ways. Cattle were found with their throats torn open, their bodies drained of blood, as if something had fed upon them in the dead of night. Hens, which had never known fear, cowered in their coops, refusing to lay eggs or even move. It wasn't just that they were dying, it was how they were dying. Something was stealing the life from them, draining them of the essence that made them whole. The fields, once teeming with life, were now silent. The creatures of the land seemed to cower beneath the weight of a darkness they could not understand. And then came the shadows. At night, when the village was still and quiet, some began to claim they saw them. Tall, twisted forms that moved just beyond the reach of the firelight. Figures that stretched too high to be human, too unnatural to be real. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, their movements impossibly fast, and when they vanished into the darkness, the chill they left behind remained, lingering like a frostbite that refused to thaw. The villagers tried to dismiss the strange sightings, attributing them to fatigue or fear. But the unease was real. It grew with each passing day, a quiet dread that settled into their bones. As the fear spread, the sickness grew worse, and even the strongest of the village found themselves plagued with unexplainable weakness, fever, and strange dreams that pulled them into an abyss of terror. The rituals, once a source of comfort, now felt hollow. The fires no longer seemed to push back the darkness, and the gods seemed silent, their favor distant. The villagers continued their prayers, but the land did not respond. And then, one night, a terrible cry pierced the air, a scream so blood-curdling that it froze every soul who heard it. The cry did not come from man or beast, but from something deeper, something primal. It was a sound that spoke of suffering beyond understanding, a wail that echoed through the trees and across the hills. It was a cry that pierced the silence of the night, sending waves of terror through the hearts of all who heard it. And from there, everything grew darker. In the Norse world, death was never seen as an end. It was merely a transition, a passage from one realm to the next. For the people who had lived through the harsh winters and brutal battles, death was an inevitable part of life, one they believed was shaped by the gods themselves. But as the darkness crept further into their world, something began to shift in the way they viewed death and the dead. As strange sicknesses swept through the villages, many began to die in horrific, unnatural ways. Some were found with their faces frozen in terror, eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths twisted into silent screams. Others died with no cause at all, healthy one day, cold and lifeless the next. But it was the manner of their passing and the way they were buried that would spark an ancient fear in the hearts of the villagers. The dead were not always treated with the reverence they once had. Fear of the restless spirits that might rise from the grave led the villagers to take drastic measures to ensure that those who passed would stay where they belonged, beneath the earth. The burial rituals, once simple and solemn, now became twisted with superstition. Large stones were placed over the graves, meant to pin the body down, to keep it from rising again. For those who had died under particularly suspicious circumstances, stakes were driven through their hearts, an ancient practice believed to stop the dead from walking again. There were whispers that the dead were rising, walking under the cover of night, and some of the villagers feared that it wasn't just the sickness that was spreading. It was the very souls of the departed, restless and hungry for vengeance. As the darkness grew stronger, so did the fear that death might not be the end after all. There were even reports of figures seen stumbling through the woods at night, cloaked in the same darkness that had overtaken the land. They moved with an unnatural speed, and when they passed near a house, a cold wind would follow them, leaving only an unbearable silence in their wake. The villagers grew desperate, performing the burial rituals with increasing violence. They bound the bodies with chains and nails, using whatever they could find to ensure the spirits would not return. Some bodies were cremated, their ashes scattered to the winds, in the hope that no trace would remain. But no matter what they did, no matter how many nails were hammered into the ground, the fear persisted, because something had changed. The spirits of the dead were no longer passive, peaceful entities. They were angry, restless souls, their fates intertwined with the curse that had begun to consume the living. At night, when the wind howled through the trees, the villagers would hear strange noises coming from the graveyards, scraping sounds, like nails on stone, or low, guttural growls that echoed from the earth. Sometimes, the ground would shift, as if something beneath it was stirring, trying to break free. The fear was no longer just about the living, it was about the dead who refused to stay buried. The souls that had been tied to this world by the darkness now clawed their way to the surface, driven by something they could not comprehend: revenge, hunger, or perhaps the call of the very curse that had condemned them. Because some of the dead refused to stay buried. And then, one night, beneath the blood-red moon, it rose, taller than any man, its body twisted and bound in chains. Its eyes burned with an unnatural fire, its breath hollow and ragged. The earth cracked beneath it as it emerged, dragging its chains through the dirt, a dark omen made flesh. It wasn't just a spirit, it was the wrath of the dead, a force that could not be buried. And some say, on stormy nights you can still hear it, its chains dragging through the darkness, searching for those who dared forget what should never have been left behind.